slides.
Welcome, I'm Lee Barrett, Professor of Theology at Lancaster Theological Seminary. Actually, I have to catch myself there. We merged with Moravian University, so we are now Lancaster Theological Seminary of the School of Theology of Moravian University on the NB Barcelona campus. And we're going to talk for 5 weeks about the future and about Christian attitudes towards the future, because they have been all over the map, from extreme optimism to extreme pessimism. And I think this is an important issue to delve into, since how should we think about the future has become actually a political and a cultural issue, in that every time you turn around, somebody's doing a poll about, do you think the country is going in the right direction? And do you think your life will be better than that of your parents? And the polls go up and down. One interesting fact is that when these polls started around 1996, people asking, are you optimistic, are you pessimistic about the future? In 1996, 81% of the American population said that they thought the future would be better than the past. Now, that's down to 47%. So there's been a huge plunge of pessimism, actually, with many people thinking that their lives will not be better than those of their parents. What you mean by better, of course, is up for grabs. And in the history of the West, and we're going to do a little general background before we look at Christianity in particular, I think there have been 5 positions about thinking about the future of the world that have emerged. One, I'm going to call nostalgic, and it's back to the golden age. That somewhere in the past, there was a time when life was good, when there was friendship and prosperity and good feelings. In Latin, that's called the illud tempus, back to the past. And that has been around forever. In the Bible, it's the Garden of Eden. Go back to the Garden of Eden. And in different forms of Greek and Roman mythology, it's the same thing. There was a golden age in the past, and if we could recover it, that would be wonderful. But right now, we're living in an age of darkness. And that's in our political rhetoric all over the place. Make America great again, which implies that there was a time when it was great, and we have to get back to that time. And other countries are doing that. I do a lot of work in Denmark, and in Denmark there were people with baseball caps that said in Danish, make Denmark great again. And I always asked, when was the first time? And the answer was always in 1248, when we ruled Sweden. It's been downhill ever since. But everybody wants to get back, or a lot of people do want to get back to a golden age. For Americans, I think that probably means the 1950s, with the Cold War and the threat of nuclear holocaust left out. The age of station wagons, golden retrievers, picket fences, explosion in the suburbs, GI Bill, economic prosperity. Everybody owed the United States money from World War II loans. And it was the age of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. And then the Andy Griffith Show, back to Mayberry. So getting back to a time that was past and has vanished, or is being threatened and endangered, has been a perennial attitude of the human spirit. It takes different forms in different generations. And then there's the opposite. The past was lousy. That was a time of darkness and sinister evil. And we've left that behind, and now we're moving on towards utopia. We're moving on towards something better than humanity has ever seen before. A utopianism, a belief in inevitable and endless progress. Now that's actually a recent phenomenon in the history of humanity. And it only appeared in a strong way in the 18th century, when there was observable progress. Progress in agriculture, canals being built in Europe, advances in shipbuilding, advances in mining, some advances in medicine even. The age of Isaac Newton and John Locke. Some technological improvements, which would pick up steam and steam engines, would pick up steam as the 18th century progressed and blossom in the 19th, and then seem to continue into the 20th and 21st. Better living through chemistry. Death rates going down, infant mortality down. Eventually infant mortality going down throughout the world by the late 20th century. So that gave folk the impression that economic, technological, scientific progress was unlimited and would continue, and that the future would be much better than the past. I remember growing up in the 1950s, and that was just in the air on every TV commercial. Like, this cornflake is better than the old cornflakes. Of course, there was a little footnote, ignore the bomb shelters. And ignore the strange drills that high schools had where you get under the table so your oak desk would protect you from nuclear holocaust. Just ignore that and just focus on the fact that technology is improving, science is improving, medicine's improving, diseases are being eliminated, that things like measles would be eliminated forever. Oh yeah, I forgot, it hasn't been. Not much bubonic plague. So that was the utopianism, the millennium, the reign of love, peace, and justice in the future. Maybe any day now. So they have the extremely negative, or the one back to the past, to the golden age. Then the opposite. Let's look forward to the golden age in the future. And then there are some other ones that are a little more moderate and nuanced. One was a cyclical view of history, that the past will be repeated in the future, that the bad times will come again, and the good times will come again. So just hang on. It's a roller coaster. You go up and down. Empires rise and empires fall. The stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. There are technological advances, but they almost always have a downside. So things will just fluctuate through history. So just strap yourself in and enjoy the ride. And if there's something good, it will come back. But also, if there's something bad going on, that'll come back to it. That fascism could be eliminated for a while, but it will return. Democracy might flourish, but it will take some hits, but it'll return. To everything there is a season. It's like nature. There will be spring, and there will be autumn, and there will be winter. But then there'll be spring again. So just get used to it. It's all going to come back. And then there was a fourth view, which I'm going to call static, that things really aren't getting better, but they're also not getting much worse. That if there are some improvements, they're balanced by some devolution going on somewhere. Some things are getting better, some things are getting worse. That's the way it is. That's the way it always has been. That's the way it always will be. There will always be tragedy, there will always be disease, but there will also always be some happiness and some satisfaction. But it's not getting any better. And then the last one is probably the bleakest of all, and that's steady decline. That there really was no golden age in the past. Maybe things were a little bit better, but ever since then, it's been downhill. And it's going to be further downhill until things absolutely collapse. The story of perpetual devolution. Now you might think that's really strange, and who would ever believe that? But entire cultures have. I think the most extreme example was probably Norse culture, where they believed that if you were, for example, a warrior, a Viking in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, your goal was to die in battle, sword in hand, and then you'd go to Valhalla, the afterlife, and feast with the gods. Drink a lot of ale, brawl, do the things that Vikings like to do for fun. And so that sounds pretty good if you're into that. But the rest of the story was, and then the frost giants will come and fight a battle with the dead warriors and the gods. And the dead warriors and the gods are going to lose. Goddardammerung, the end of the gods. And then there will be perpetual frozen winter everywhere in the entire universe. Have a nice day. So you know, if you were a devout Norse person, circa 900 AD, that's what you had to look forward to. Yeah, we're going to get killed, we're going to go to heaven, we're going to party for a while, and then everything's going to be obliterated. And other cultures have had that same very bleak vision. And as we'll see, so have some Christians. The story of humanity is the story of increasing sinfulness and evil that will finally triumph. The bad guys will win in this world, at which time God's going to have to step in and put an end to it. And then the righteous people, the faithful people, will live on in heaven. But this world's literally going to hell in a handbasket. And it will get so bad that God will have to just end it and say, you know, that experiment was a colossal failure and a mistake. So again, these 5 positions were back to the golden age, that's 1. Look forward to a utopian future, that's endless progress, that's 2. And then what goes around comes around, cyclical, 3. And then everything's pretty much static, it's not getting better, it's not getting worse. Overall, was 4, and then the last one was steady decline. So what I'd like to do now is just pause and ask you, which of these views do you adhere to yourself? And there's going to be no right answer, so nobody's going to say, well, that's not the Presbyterian response, so you have to leave Derry Presbyterian. How many, show of hands, for back to the Garden of Eden, back to the Golden Age? The glory was in the past. That's really weird. I'm kind of stunned. I was hoping we'd have a lively conversation and debate, but evidently nobody likes that one. How about endless progress towards a utopian future? 2. Okay. So far we got 0 and 2. How about cyclical? What goes around, oh my goodness. I can't even, that's like everybody. Wow. You're all Hindus. Well, I'll go through the other ones anyway. Static. Same old, same old. Or as I think it was Henry Ford said, history is just one damn thing after another. No takers. How about decline? Got 1, okay. So 2 for progress, 1 for decline, and everybody else is cyclical. Never in a million years would I have predicted that.
Did you ever present this in front of your students? I wonder how younger people think.
Well, actually, my oldest student is 88. But we do have some, maybe 20% of them are in their 20s, early 30s. Yeah, I have. It's more evenly distributed, and still more, probably the majority on progress. But then they qualify that the progress will not be steady. It'll be like the economy. Up, down, up, down, up, down, but the overall tendency is up. I haven't done it this year. It might be different. So, now I'm going to shift gears into what have Christians believed about this, and then we're going to look at the various options in more detail. So this is going to be a little thumbnail sketch of biblical and history of the Christian church. Well, let's start with the Old Testament. In the earliest strata of the Old Testament, in fact, in most of the Old Testament, it's really not an issue, or if it is, it falls in the static category. Because most of the Old Testament is devoted to how are we going to hang on? How are the people of Israel going to survive? So they don't expect things to get better. What they really hope for is just survival, that their ethnicity, their race will not be exterminated, that their enemies will not destroy them. You know, think of all the Psalms that say things like, deliver us from the hand of our enemies, you know, deliver us from travail. So it was mostly a religion of deliverance from present danger, without much hope that things would get better. So the attitude seems to have been, it's always been like this. We've always been clobbered by somebody. The Babylonians, the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Everybody has come through and tried to incorporate us into their empire and destroy our culture. So our only hope is that they won't win. But we expect that there's always going to be somebody out to get us. So that was earliest Israel, and that, for many Jews, that sensibility never went away. It's always going to be rough. We're always going to be persecuted. The most we can hope for is that God will give us the fortitude and the perseverance to hang on and keep going. But then in some later parts of the Old Testament, a different theme emerged, which was, yeah, life is bad, but somehow God is going to miraculously intervene and bring about love, peace, and justice on earth. That's in the prophetic literature. And swords will be beaten into plowshares, and the lion will lay down with the wolf. As one person said, and the lamb's going to be very scared. And there will be a land flowing with milk and honey, and there will be prosperity and peace. So that became a theme in some of the later prophets. But it was going to be brought about by God. They knew that human beings couldn't do it. So the notion was just hang on until God does something to usher in a future utopia. And then in the very late period of the Old Testament, and actually it's the period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, an even starker theme emerged, probably based to their exposure to some Persian beliefs when they were in exile in Babylon, that history is really a struggle of good and evil. There are good guys and bad guys, children of light and children of darkness. And eventually, God will enable the children of light to prevail. So that was the first time there was some notion of progress that involved human beings. And that got intensified during the period of the Maccabees, when there was a Jewish revolt against their Hellenistic rulers, and they won. But it also involved the slaughter of lots of Jews, including many of the Maccabees, the family that was leading the revolt. And then the notion arose that they are martyrs, and that they will be taken by God into a heavenly place, and they will intervene with God to make sure that God stays on track and enables the revolt to prosper and the people of Israel to prevail free of bondage to Macedonia, Greece, Syria, Rome, or anybody else. And that was the world into which Jesus was born. So there was already a notion of divine intervention in history, and God working through human beings to bring about peace and justice. And Jesus' language is filled with very optimistic predictions of the triumph of God, that the Son of Man will return, and peace will be restored on earth, and everyone will flourish. And in Paul, the Apostle Paul, that theme became very prominent. It was sort of on steroids. In chapters like Romans 8, Paul says the whole creation is yearning for its redemption. And that redemption will happen. That God will intervene and make things right for not only all humanity, but for every living creature. The whole ecological sphere will be perfected, and there will be peace. Some followers of Paul in the next couple of generations included things like, there won't be carnivorous animals anymore. That was kind of a mistake, where creation went wrong. God never intended tigers to rip apart gazelles. And they got kind of fanciful that in the new era that God will initiate, when the promise in Romans 8 that all the groaning of all creation will be alleviated, that a lion will just go up to a gazelle, and the gazelle will have a chunk of meat, sort of like you milk a cow. So the gazelle would just voluntarily squeeze some meat out and give it to the lion, and the lion would be happy. The gazelle had some excess weight, so the gazelle's happy, and everybody, it's a win-win situation. Or maybe all animals would become vegetarian. But anyway, it was thought that there are problems not only with human society, but even with nature. There's tension and pain and tragedy in nature itself, and that will eventually be healed. Now, the big question was, when? When's that going to happen? If you look at Paul's epistles closely, and even the Gospels, it looks like earliest Christians expected it like any day now. It says, this generation will not pass away before the Son of Man has returned. And Paul seems to be expecting the second coming of Christ any minute. So the first generation of Christians from Paul on were like sitting on the edge, just thinking any night we might get up, wake up, and in the morning there will be love, peace, and justice on earth, and Jesus will be ruling everything. And there will be a millennium, 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, and all tears will be dried, and tragedy and misery will be no more. As we'll see, that sense that Jesus is going to come any day now, and Jesus is going to fix everything, and there will not be suffering or war or injustice, or even blood in the great chain of being in the ecological cycle. There won't be carnivorous animals anymore. There won't be earthquakes. There won't be droughts. That has recurred again and again in the history of Christianity. It was big. It was just universal in the first century of Christianity. They were waiting for Jesus. Jesus was going to correct everything. But it's come back periodically. Came back around the year 1000. which was the turn of the millennium. Much of Europe was convinced that when he woke up, when we went to sleep on 999, and then woke up day 1 of the year 1000, that Jesus would have returned and transformed everything. And among other things, there would be no more work. A good deal. But as a result, they didn't plant crops. Because they figured, we're not going to be here next year, so why do we have to raise anything? You know, food will just be falling out of the sky. And so there's vast famine in the year 1000. Nearer to home here, over in Lancaster County, are you all familiar with the Ephrata Cloisters? Ever been there?
Yeah.
They were a community devoted to expecting the return of Jesus any night. In fact, they were a Protestant sort of monastic community formed in the 1720s, 1730s. They kind of died out by 1790 because they were celibate, therefore didn't have children, and they didn't engage in evangelism. Now, that's not a recipe for church growth. So they did die out pretty much. There's a handful that are left, people who converted to it. But they, in their community, they would get up at 3 a.m. every day and sing odd songs that their leader, Conrad Weissel, had composed with his own harmonic system, which was very eerie. He called it the music of the angels. They'd get up, go outside, gather together, and sing, just in case that was the night that Jesus was going to return. They wanted to be singing and worshiping when Jesus came. In the 1840s, another group called the Millerites in Western New York, which are the ancestors of both the Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. The Millerites, following a guy named Miller, gathered on a hill in 1844 in New York because Miller had predicted that was where Jesus was going to return and make everything all right. Didn't happen. So his followers were disappointed. So then he recalculated and said he was off by a year. So the next year they all gathered on the same hill in Western New York, and Jesus was a no-show. So then their leader, Miller, said Jesus had returned, but was invisible, and is ruling the world from the heavens. And that's still a belief of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. So I just mentioned that because the theme that Jesus will return and fix it all, and that's going to happen soon, was a perennial theme in much of Christianity. And then, but then, with the Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century, and his favoring of Christianity, Christians changed. And many thought, well, we don't have to wait for Jesus to return because the emperor is going to fix everything. The emperor has gone from persecuting us to being one of us and promoting us. He's building churches. Christianity is spreading. People are converting. So they began to think that thanks to the help of the Roman Empire and the Roman army, that Christianity would spread throughout the world and everybody would convert. And we were on the cusp of a golden age of Christ ruling through the emperor. And that notion never quite went away in some parts of Christianity, that we're winning, we're spreading, the whole world is getting more Christianized, and sooner or later, Christianity will spread love, peace, and justice throughout the world. That still fuels, for example, Russian Orthodoxy, and originally it's hoped that the Tsar would eventually dominate the world and that Orthodox Christianity would be global. Now, strangely, that's been transferred to Putin. Under Putin, Russian Orthodoxy will spread, and the whole world will be Christianized, and there'll be love, peace, and justice from now on. And that attitude fueled the Crusades. Like, Christianity is winning. It's spreading. So let's go conquer the Muslims. And they will either gladly convert and become Christians, and there will be Christianity throughout the world, or they can be exterminated, or they'll just die out. So that more optimistic notion that Christianity will win, that it's spreading, became very widespread and never went away. And then Reformation happened. And with that, somebody you're all familiar with, John Calvin, who developed the theme that, yes, God will win, the whole world will be Christianized, there will be love, peace, and justice on earth, but it's going to happen because God is working through us. We are God's hands. God is sovereign. God's in control of history, so don't worry, it's going to turn out well. God's purposes will be achieved, but God chooses to use us as God's instruments. So that led to, for Presbyterians and others, a extreme interest in projects to make life better on earth. It could be philanthropic projects, building orphanages, universities, schools, seminaries, as Calvin did. It could lead to a certain kind of militarism, to use military force to oppose the enemies of Christianity, or more particularly, the enemies of Protestantism, aka Catholics. And in the United States, that would become very dominant, thanks to the Puritans, who are both Presbyterian and Congregational, that God is working through human beings, and not only through the church, but through the secular agencies, the political and economic systems. God's working through everything to make life better. And eventually, there will be love, peace, and justice on earth when we respond to God and become God's co-workers, God's co-partners. And that would become a major theme in American politics, that God is working through the United States to Christianize and humanize the world. That was a major theme for Woodrow Wilson, for example, who was a devout Presbyterian, in fact, a kind of Presbyterian on steroids, who said, as he was trying to persuade the United States to enter World War I, that the purpose of the war was to make the world safe for democracy. But he added, and that's usually not reported, he usually added, and reformed Christianity. So God working through the armies of the Allies to fight old-style, imperial, usually Catholic or Orthodox Europe. What we have now is all of them have survived. That we still have the folk who expect Jesus to return any day now. We'll talk about that. You may remember, for example, the popularity of the late great planet Earth and rapture fascination, and people wearing loose clothes and sandals in case they got raptured up. You don't want to get raptured up with a necktie and a suit. You got to have some sweat clothes you can shed pretty easily as you go through the air. And then that appeared again in the 1990s with the Left Behind series, and that's still going on. So you still have that Jesus is going to return and fix it all, and then you still have the God is working through us to make life better. We are God's hands and feet in the world. We are God's tools, God's instruments, and the sovereign God will win. And we also have survival of the, well, history is just one damn thing after another. There's not going to be much progress, so what you should do is just hope for yourself and your loved ones, your family, going to heaven. Because on earth, it's not going to get much better, or any better. You still have that. What you don't have is the cyclical theory, except here. So I'm happy now I can add that to the things that never went away. So in our upcoming weeks, what I hope to do is delve into these positions in more detail, show where they came from and where they're very active now in the church and in the world and in the political arena. Because all of these views have advocates who are politically powerful. And it's very much in our culture and in our airwaves, and is creating a lot of tension, especially between the folk who expect gradual progress through God working through us, versus the folk who think things are going to get worse until God intervenes and makes it better. Just a footnote to that for coming attractions. Some of the people who believe that we're going to hell in a handbasket and things are going to get worse until Jesus returns try to promote the return of Jesus by making things worse. You know, let's promote war, or let's just let it happen, and collapse of society. Let's just watch it, and it will run its course, and finally, out of God's mercy, God will return and fix everything. Well, what I'd like to do now is open this for conversation. Yeah.
Actually, I was wondering if you could go back to the beginning and re-poll, because I'm wondering if I was one of the two, progress, but I don't deny cyclicality. So, I mean, do people think it's, it's truly up and down but a flat line, or up and down but going upward?
Or maybe spiral.
Well, okay.
Yeah. Or a roller coaster. I don't know why I'm thinking roller coasters. A roller coaster where eventually it goes upward.
But how many people think, okay, there's cyclicality, but, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice?
Yeah.
Is it going up but cyclical? Does anybody
agree
to that?
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay, show of hands. How about that as an option? It's cyclical, there's ups and downs, but overall there's going to be progress.
Positive slope.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me get very concrete about it. How many think that either through a nuclear holocaust or through the destruction of the ecosphere, humanity's pretty much doomed?
You mean that it will happen and we'll kill ourselves, in other words?
Yeah. That we will succeed in exterminating ourselves. One person.
Well,
Way far out.
So not tomorrow. Yeah.
Can we vote on a different method? Honestly, I'm a little more worried about AI.
Well, yes. And AI is often pointed to as one of the examples in which progress, what looks like progress, can actually be a recipe for destruction.
yeah, sure.
Robots. What if robotics succeeds, AI succeeds on a massive scale, and most of humanity is put out of work?
The classic is for me is that one is iRobot, when they point out the fact that the only way to protect man from man is to basically eliminate man. And the logic, I do believe their logic is appropriate. We do not seem to show the ability to change ourselves, and so the AI was eliminating us.
Takers for that view? The artificial intelligence wins because they're smarter than we are.
I put it on the secular thing that like AI may be the way, but then at some point man's gonna smarten up and go, oh, nope, I gotta take care of this, unplug this thing.
It's called
you know?
unplug.
Yeah, pull the plug.
Yeah, pull the
You know,
plug.
because, yeah, the machines can be more perfect than man, so if we gave them the ability to rule over us, they're gonna judge us inferior, because it's just, it's what makes man unique, is that we don't operate like a machine. We don't follow all the rules. We don't do the best thing, considered the best thing for ourselves. We kind of go off on our little own way, you know, and that's, I could see that if you put machines in charge of us, they would start saying, ooh, or like they're babies that need to be caged or something.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
Yeah, and there are all sorts of dystopian movies and books, novels.
But I think eventually, you know, because of the erratic behavior of humans, we would stop
Pull the
the
plug,
AI.
yeah.
Yes.
It's interesting that the topic, although you were cyclical and more recently cyclical with some guarded optimism of long-term progress.
What are we talking about, though?
Yeah, the conversation turns to the destruction of, the possible destruction of everything due to, or at least of humanity due to AI. And that has happened over and over again in recent history, where folk were believing in progress and hoping for progress, but in the background there was a dark fear that it might all be over. You know, the 50s and 60s, nuclear holocaust. And that generated, remember, if you were of a certain age, all the movies, usually from Japan, home of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of monsters like Godzilla and Gorgo and Rodan, who had been exposed to radiation and then came out of nowhere and started to destroy civilization. That was a real fear. That in spite of the veneer of prosperity and happiness in the United States, there was this fear of it could go away, and it didn't. So it used to be radiation, nuclear holocaust. And now it's the innumerable movies about the threat of robots and AI.
But to go back to an unexpected event during World War I, in 1918, in that era, when the flu epidemic hit,
Yeah.
it was not even considered, and it became catastrophic to society, where a lot of people died rather quickly. A bubonic plague
Oh, yeah.
of a modern era. We just escaped a plague of sorts, and yet we got another one facing us in bird flu or its ramifications, but we seem to be doing less about it now than we did 100 years ago.
You're depressing me.
Well, obviously I watch too much news.
But all that's true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
We all do.
but it's one of these things that, yeah, we may have optimism, but there are sometimes things that happen outside of our control
Yeah.
that just make things that you have to be prepared and be aware.
So don't just worry about AI, worry about the next plague.
They may
Yeah.
be in concert, who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah. No, that's entirely true.
Yeah.
Or, the meteor that's gonna hit the earth.
Yeah.
Going back to your what you were presenting, prior to the Calvinists, the Reformation, when when you said the attitude became more that, we were God's workers and we would do the improvement ourselves. Before that, are you saying that largely people said, well, it's out of our hands and we can't do anything about it?
Partly, many, yeah.
Yeah.
Or the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages actually declared that this is the millennium. The triumph of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages over most of Europe was indeed the Golden Age, the reign of God on earth. God was reigning through the Pope. So what's there to do? No, just be a good Catholic, because this is it. This is as good as it gets. Calvin did shake that up. I want to do a little quick test, see how good Presbyterians you are. It's going to be options A, B, and C. Option A is God works miraculously, directly, without humans to bring about happiness. Okay, that's option A. Option B is humans don't need God's grace. They can bring about love, peace, and justice on earth through their own efforts. Option C is God sovereignly works through human beings as God's instruments to bring about improvements on earth. How many would go for A? How many would go for B? I forgot what B was. Oh, B was we're smart enough to do it on our own. Okay. How about C? Okay, that's with one dissenter. That's the majority view, and that is the Presbyterian view. So I take it back. You're in the right place. You can stay.
We are a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Does that include like little miracles from God?
Yeah, there could be little. Yeah. God.
Just the little ones?
Yeah.
All on his own?
Yeah. The full view of Calvin would be God's going to win. There's no way in hell. No, that's wrong. There's no way on earth that God's purposes could be frustrated. But God nudges us, coaxes us, inspires us, guides us, and sometimes, if necessary, will override us. That would be a miracle. To make sure that God will win in the end. God will be victorious. But we can't take credit for that. It's primarily God's doing. And God, just out of mercy and grace towards us, allows us to be God's co-workers. Because God realizes that would give us this kind of spiritual satisfaction, to know that we had contributed something. God could do it all by God's self, but God delegates to us, and guides and coaxes and directs, and will override if we really screw up.
Does he ever get exhausted? Far out. I think far out. I think he's going to be tired.
Just say, I'm tired of this. These people aren't getting on board with this program. Yeah.
Not listening.
Well, except God's infinitely powerful and infinitely patient. So if you're a good Presbyterian, don't have to worry about that. God's going to get exhausted and take a day off.
God will let Jim Carrey take over.
Right. Yeah. You have a person in the back?
Yeah, so I believe in C, but I also believe in A because I think there are miracles where God does things separate from us using a person. I think things that happen that are miraculous and have to be directly from God.
Yeah, and Calvin and the Reformed tradition and Presbyterians would agree.
Yeah.
That, so for example, these days the view would be that God wants there to be peace on earth. So God will inspire, guide, coax, urge human diplomats, politicians, the electorates to bring back, to settle disputes. However, if it looks really bad, and it looks like somebody is going to push the nuclear button or ignite a war that is avoidable, then God will miraculously intervene and stop it. So yeah, there are miracles in this view, but they have to be kept at a minimum. Because you don't want the politicians and the diplomats and the international relations folk to stop working and become passive.
Yes, we did.
So God's general modus operandi is to work through us. But if necessary, God will directly intervene. And has, and does.
To that idea, originally I did vote for things being cyclical because it has been in the past, so why doesn't it go into the future? But I don't hold out that it is impossible that we destroy ourselves, because today with computers, AI, you can do things much faster and more widespread with computers and so forth, that we could destroy ourselves just because of the age that we're coming into. The last 100 years, it went in cycles. The next 100 years with computers and so forth, and looking at the kids and everything that are on tablets and computers all the time, I think there will be a way that we could possibly pretty much destroy ourselves. But that's not necessarily what I believe, but I think it is something that could happen.
It's a threat.
This class is really bumming me out. Okay, let's say because of the rise of technology and the proliferation and improvements in technology, including AI, and just the electronics revolution in general, it is increasingly possible to do more damage than it had been in the past. And you can do a lot more damage with an atomic weapon than you can with a catapult or a slingshot, so that our capacity to destroy is becoming augmented infinitesimally almost. So that could happen. How many would think that if humanity was on the verge of doing something like that, would God intervene and protect us from ourselves?
Possible.
Or would God let it happen?
I think about Noah's Ark.
Let's
just start over.
So if a few would be, or something would be saved, for God to rework and start over. Hopefully Presbyterians.
Because I think of like how lately our knowledge of prehistoric man has been changing. Like where they're finding whole villages built underground, which were around the time of the Ice Age, which meant probably the majority of man or human-like people would have passed during that time, but yet there were survivors that rebuilt. And I think that's my view. If something catastrophic happened, that man as a entity or a thing that God would rebuild us again and let us try again. But me personally probably would not. If I had to go back to living in the woods and stuff, would survive. You know?
So that is the Noah Ark view,
Yeah.
that there will be a remnant.
Yeah.
I think a classic example is go to Israel. They have been a minority group of people since about biblical times. They seem to succeed, then they get crushed. Then they seem to succeed, they get crushed. But they're there. They don't disappear. They may be scattered,
Yeah.
but I keep, as I read the Bible and read these old stories, you begin to question these are the, quote, chosen people, yet they don't seem to be doing much. They're there. They're not as powerful today as they may have been in previous years, and yet
Yeah,
they
well,
stand
in
up.
fact, Netanyahu has said that.
Yes.
Said that Hamas and Hezbollah are nothing new.
Oh, no.
So
yeah.
first it was the Egyptians, then it was the Philistines, then it was the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans,
Yeah.
then the Nazis, and now Hamas and Hezbollah. He said it's always been this way, and it always will be. And therefore, we just have to persevere and be diligent. Yeah.
Now I'm losing my thought here. No, go ahead and go on, I'm sorry. I was listening to that and on top of it, then I lost my thought. Oh, now okay. What I was thinking was, I'm not going to try to outguess God, because God will take care of me, will take care of all of us, and whether man destroys himself or whether God intervenes, that doesn't bother me, because God will take care of all of us. And it reminds me of a quote I read. It says, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
You know, that is a very perfect Calvinist response, that it's in God's hands. God is sovereign. Whatever happens, somehow or other, God will work with it. And ultimately, it's not our problem.
And why should we worry?
Yeah, yeah. Do what you can. Do what you can to create peace, love, and justice on earth. But ultimately, it's all in God's hands.
Does that make you feel better now?
A little bit. Yeah. Well, and that is the Reformed response, the Presbyterian response usually, that we should not be anxious, because no matter what happens, God is sovereign, and God can weave whatever happens into God's purposes. So, but the footnote is, but try your hardest in the meantime.
Yeah.
Get on those committees. Don't stay home on Sunday morning. You know, work, the Protestant work ethic. Work to bring about love, peace, and justice on earth. But in the long run, no, it's not going to be up to you. It's going to be God's will. And God has promised that there will someday be love, peace, and justice. I'm trying to make myself feel better.
Doesn't this all tie in some way to the what is it called? Theodicy? You know, the question of good and evil, and what God will do for us, can do for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it does. And it's a bit of a tangent, but just in the Reformed tradition, of which Presbyterians are part, there has always been a tendency to say, even if tragedy strikes, that's God's will, and God's going to bring good out of it somehow. In the French and Indian War, the early phases, there was a Catholic and Huron attack on a little Reformed village in Deerfield, Massachusetts. And the people in Deerfield left a diary. They knew the French and the Native Americans were coming their way in massive numbers, and that they were going to be targeted. But like good Reformed people, in their diaries, they wrote, well, we might prevail, or we might get exterminated. But either way, it's in God's hands, and we'll accept it. And actually, they were exterminated. So that is a recurrent theme in the Reformed tradition, that things could get bad, at least from our perspective, they look bad. But in the long run, God is still sovereign, and God can work, God can bring good out of this somehow. I think we have time for one more observation. I mean, in terms of the time of this class, not, not before a doom.
Anybody else?
Okay, well, next week, and in future weeks, we're going to take a closer look at the various options. Next week, we're gonna take a look at what's called the apocalyptic option, that things will remain steady or get worse until God will directly intervene. And then, due to the second coming of Christ, then and only then will things get better, and all tears will be dried. So that will be for next week.
Very good.
Thank
Thank you.
Big bang.
Should I put your pen on that?